I hope you're having a great day today. So good to be back in class again in modern church history. Today we take a sixth look at the life of Jonathan Edwards, and we look at the time in which he was a master's student at Yale. Now I think that sometimes this period in Jonathan Edwards' life can be played down, and yet it is very, very formative. It's the time in which he falls in love. Yes, you might wonder whether he's robbing the cradle or not, but at this age he falls in love. It's also a time of great intellectual excitement as a master's student, as he's reading widely and he's making a lot of progress intellectually. He is trying to study and learn the currents of the age, and so he is very interested in books that come from England. It's also a time of spiritual growth. He's undergone a spiritual transformation, and he now has an assurance for the first time in his life that he is truly a child of God. And there are some spiritual bumps he goes through, and yet it's a time of growth and maturity, just like for many young people. Those ages, those college years, from when a student is 18 to 22 can have a transformative effect on their life. And that was the case, I think, with Edwards too, although at this time he actually is a master's student because he already has his bachelor's degree. The story starts with him as a master's student being an unordained pulpit supply in a little Presbyterian church that's a breakaway church in New York City. Edwards graduated from Yale in 1720 when he was 17 years old. And then he spent 3 years working on his master's. Back in those days, the master's program was mainly an independent study, and so the student would engage in studies and then he would write a master's thesis. And so Jonathan Edwards is working on that during this time. Now, in New York City, there was a fight in a little Presbyterian church, unfortunately. And so the little church underwent a split. One reason for the controversy in the church was that there were the Scottish Presbyterians who thought that you should only sing the Psalms in an English translation that was very close to the original Hebrew, where there are others who allowed for more of a looser translation and singing of the Psalms, like Isaac Watts wrote songs that came from the Psalms, which made their way, for example, in the 1912 Psalter, so are widely sung today. But that was controversial in New York City in this church, and so there was a split over that and some other matters. And so now you had two little Presbyterian groups, and Jonathan Edwards, as a master's student, was asked to come and be pulpit supply for this one splinter group. Now, he is only 19 years old at this time, but this is actually one of the highlights of his early career. He is a young man, he's gifted, he is able to put sermons together. Apparently, that was a lot of work for him yet, but it's something that he was able to do. And for him, it was a delight to be in the beautiful city of New York. Now, I've gone to New York City, and New York City today, of course, is a far cry from what things were like back then. Back then, it was a harbor town, a beautiful, beautiful place. In fact, Edwards delighted in how beautiful the town was. He could walk along the harbors, see all the ships in the harbors. It was very beautiful. It was also a time of spiritual growth and joy for him. And then on top of that, he had a very positive relationship with the people with whom he housed. He stayed in the home of a lady whose name was Susanna Smith and her son John. The lady was a widow, and she and her son had recently immigrated from England, but they were very committed Christians. They were committed Presbyterians. A wonderfully spiritual mom and son. And so Jonathan Edwards had a wonderful time staying at their home. He had such sweet conversations about spiritual things with Mrs. Smith, and then he and John would walk around town and also have wonderful Christian conversations, a wonderfully mature little family he stayed at. Edwards also tells us that it was from this date that he became interested in learning anything he could about the progress of the kingdom of God worldwide. He was in New York City, of course, and that's where ships were coming from various places around the globe, and so it was a center of information. Newspapers could come from England or from other places, and so Edwards tells us that it was almost like, he was so keen about learning about any news about the progress of the kingdom, he would devour it. He said if he would hear anything that had a favorable aspect on the interests of Christ's kingdom, it excited him. He said he wanted to read in the newspaper or learn anything that gave news favorable to the interests of religion in the world. Now, one motive for Edwards wanting to learn this information wasn't so good. The problem is that he was a post-millennial in his eschatology. Therefore, he thought that in the last days, things would get better and better and better until the entire world would be Christianized. And therefore, when he heard reports about positive things happening, he thought, well, maybe we're at the edge of the millennium. In fact, at times when he saw the local revivals breaking out in Northampton, he got all excited. He thought maybe this was like the sign of the beginning of a worldwide revival that would lead to the millennium and to the whole world becoming Christianized. In fact, some of his English critics challenged him on this, especially for thinking that little New England in Northampton was somehow the center of the universe and the center of the kingdom. Edwards, though, had a blessed time, and what happened is something commendable. He gave counsel to these little Presbyterian groups to not break apart. He encouraged them to reunite, and in fact, his pastoral advice played a positive role. And what happened is that after about 6 months or so, those two groups decided to get back together again, and that was good because they both were small. But Edwards also had worked himself out of a job, as it were, and now he was returning back home again. And it's quite something to read his thoughts about leaving New York City and this first little group that he had pastored, and especially Mrs. Smith and John. He says in April of 1723, he writes about his departure. It was very bittersweet. He says, I came away from New York in the month of April 1723 and had a most bitter parting with Madam Smith and her son. My heart seemed to sink within me at leaving the family and city where I enjoyed so many sweet and pleasant days. I went from New York to Wethersfield by water. As I sailed away, I kept sight of the city as long as I could, and when I was out of sight of it, it would affect me much to look that way, with a kind of melancholy mixed with sweetness. And that led him to reflect upon reunions in heaven. He reflected on how saints who appeared so lovely in this world will really be inexpressibly more lovely and full of love to us in paradise. Now, the reason I think why Edwards enjoyed his time there is that he didn't have a lot of stress at this time. That would change big time a few years in the future when he becomes a tutor at Yale. But at this time, I think it was rather stress-free. He was working with a small group, apparently, that was teachable. He formed some wonderful Christian relationships, and so it was difficult to say goodbye. Meanwhile, Jonathan Edwards is writing in his diary about his spiritual experiences, and even though his time in New York is a time of really generally spiritual highs, yet he had his ups and downs, and in there, of course, is a lesson for us. We shouldn't imagine that as Christians somehow our life is always going to be one of, finding great delight in Jesus, loving to sing the Psalms, just being bowled over by our meditations on the Word of God. Well, there are ups and downs in the Christian life, and that's something that Jonathan Edwards was experiencing as well. At this point, he certainly didn't experience the type of depression that David Brainerd would. Later on, Edwards would famously edit the diary of David Brainerd, who was an early missionary to the Indians, and in those diaries, we discover that Brainerd, he suffered with serious depression. I mean, we would call it more than melancholy, which is what they call it. We would call it clinical depression. And the problem is that David Brainerd had tuberculosis, which I'm sure contributed to this. Plus, on top of that, he had lost his mom as a child and then his dad as a teenager, and that no doubt had its effect on him. It was hurtful for his psychology. Edwards also, I think, was tempted to depression, partly due to the fact that he was an introvert. But he was an introvert, in a context where the Puritans were expecting you to do so much almost navel gazing. That is, looking at your life under a microscope, try to figure out whether or not you really could have the assurance of your salvation. Now, we know that introverts can be troubled by depression. An introvert is someone who sort of gets recharged by being by himself, An introvert contrasts with an extrovert, of course, a person who is the person who gets charged up by being around other people. That wasn't Edwards. Edwards was the introvert. He did great, for example, in one-on-one contexts, but he, throughout his life, would be troubled by depression. But during this time, it was mainly a time of joy and growth. Now, meanwhile, while Edwards is working on his master's, a year before he graduates, a little explosion happened on the campus at Yale College, and that was Timothy Cutler's apostasy at Yale in May of 1722. Jonathan is going to graduate with his master's degree 1 year later. But as he's working on this, something that is like an explosion on the playground happens at Yale College. Now, Yale College, remember, is a school that's still getting off its feet, isn't it? Remember, not too long ago, they consolidated in New Haven, and they have a rector now, a gifted rector named Timothy Cutler, he's a good teacher. Now, there might be questions about his orthodoxy, but he's a lively teacher, a decent leader. Now imagine the scene. It's May of 1722. And remember, commencement exercises in New England, these were like the community events. It was like when I was younger, how we might have big 4th of July celebrations in a town. And so this was the thing that would get people from all different directions to converge on Yale. All the supporters might come from miles away. Ministers who were inland would come for this public event. You could rub shoulders with other ministers. So it was a big social event. So imagine the scene. It's May of 1722. There are students graduating from Yale. And at this social event, Timothy Cutler is leading the prayers at the end of this time. And he dramatically communicates something that shocks the entire audience. Remember, he is the rector, the president of the school that is playing a role in preparing men for the ministry in Calvinistic congregational churches. These are nonconformist churches. That is, they are churches that were basically historically pushed outside of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And suddenly, Timothy Cutler lets it be known that he has become an Anglican, and that he was going to go back to the state church in England. Now, the way he communicated that was by concluding a prayer by saying, "And let all God's people say, Amen." Now, you might say, well, that sounds like a kind of innocent phrase. What's the big deal? But it shocked the Congregationalists in Timothy Cutler's audience, because that came from the common book of prayer, which was the Anglican liturgy that the Puritans had not wanted to go along with. George Marsden says, "This information resounded as though lightning had struck the podium. Some of the crowd might not have been surprised if lightning had struck the rector." So Timothy Cutler here signals that he is moving towards Anglicanism. He came to believe that, for example, there should be bishops and a hierarchy in the church like they had in the Church of England. He thought that somehow, in order to be a legitimate minister, you needed to be ordained in the hierarchy of bishops going way back in the church. So pretty soon, Timothy Cutler and several other ministers who had been Congregational Calvinists, guess what? They have to get on a ship and head for England so they can find a bishop to properly ordain them. And so they're implying, of course, that all the ministers among the Congregationalists are not even appropriately ordained to the ministry of the word. What had happened is that, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And what happened is that when the donation of books came for the Yale College Library, there were some books that were written by Anglican leaders and bishops and theologians. And what happened is that Timothy Cutler began reading them and became convinced of Anglican principles. Whether these were Anglican principles of all the sort of things you ought to wear, for example, or dress as a priest, which had been big controversies, how you need to wear a surplice and a gown and so on, especially the idea that there would be a hierarchy of bishops, the idea that the king or queen of England was the supreme governor of the church. And also by this time, the Anglican Church had become very weak on the doctrines of Calvinism, even though they were stated in the 39 Articles of the Church of England. And so if you wanted to be kind of loosey-goose in your theology, that was fine with Anglicanism. Well, Cutler had got 6 other local ministers and some tutors, and they had book reading groups where they discussed some of these books written by the Anglicans and became convinced. When the trustees at Yale sat Timothy Cutler down and asked him, now, when did you come to hold to some of these Anglican principles? He said, well, that's the reason why I left the pastorate in a congregational church, is because, and I took the call to become a rector here because I felt I was moving away from, congregationalism. Well, the result of this was indignation among the Congregationalists. They had started Yale to have a safe place, an orthodox place in order to train the ministers instead of sending them to Harvard, which had become liberal. And now suddenly all of New England sees, well, look what's going on here at this new college that was started by these Calvinists. You have leadership becoming Anglican. And remember, the Anglicans were the people who had persecuted the Puritans. Puritans had to flee from the King of England. They'd had to flee, or the Queen of England. They've had to flee to England first, and then the Pilgrim Fathers had, from the Netherlands, come all the way to America so that they could have religious freedom, to carry out a reformation. They thought that back in England, in the Anglican Church, there had been an unfinished reformation. And now suddenly this had happened. Yes, go ahead.
Can you detail a little bit? So what besides this did the Anglicans hold to? What sinful things that, I guess I'm asking, what did they flee from? What was the problem?
So the question is, what did the Congregationalists or the Pilgrim Fathers, what did they flee from? Well, there are a number of things. One is that, for example, there was a requirement that you needed to use the Book of Common Prayer in your service. Some of the Puritans thought that you ought not to use form prayers. Others, a big thing, of course, was the fact that the Anglican Church claimed that the King or Queen of England was either the supreme head of the church, as Henry VIII had said, or as Elizabeth said, the supreme governor of the church. Whereas, of course, the Puritans said, no, Christ is the only head and governor of the Church of Jesus Christ. But on top of that, Queen Elizabeth, for example, and her followers had been either not supportive of the doctrines of grace and Calvinism, or they had been oppositional in certain ways. But by this time, within the Anglican Church, there was just a wide variety of toleration. There was also the idea, remember, that in every town where you had an Anglican church, basically everybody in town was automatically a member. And there was no Christian discipline as a result. What had happened is that in England, people who were among the nobility and connected to the king, for example, they wanted to live sinful lifestyles, and the last thing that they wanted was to have local ministers, like in a Presbyterian context, local ministers and elders holding them accountable and carrying out Christian discipline.
So when this blew up at the graduation, how did it, the people just went home aghast, and then things...
So the question is, what happened after this happened? Did the people go home aghast? Yes, they went home aghast, and the trustees suddenly have a crisis. They need to replace the president of the college, the main teacher, the rector. And the problem there is that they went on a search to try to find a new rector, and they couldn't find one. So for at least 2 years, no one is appointed to be the rector of the college. There's a vacuum of leadership at the college. So the young kids, remember, these are teenagers at school here, and those kids were out of control. And we're going to see that Jonathan Edwards and another younger tutor later on will have to have all the weight of trying to discipline and teach these young guys.
So is that their constant problem at Yale over all this time? They couldn't find a good godly rector, and is that why it's been slowly going down?
So her question is this the reason why Yale is going down? Well, of course, there's been a long history beyond all of this. There would be, for example, some decent rectors in the future who, in fact, one person who would be a descendant of Jonathan Edwards, who would be the rector or the president there. And but more, our interest, of course, is more what's simply happened this time, and it's going to be a difficult time for the college, and this is going to also contribute to Edwards having a very difficult time as a tutor. Go ahead.
So the Puritans would believe in the Lord's Supper formula using the prayer in there, wouldn't they?
So she asked, would the Puritans have liked using the Reformed form for the Lord's Supper where there's a written out prayer? And the answer is no, they wouldn't have liked to use that. They would have rather have the minister at the Lord's Supper just give a free prayer.
So would they just want to use the form, or would they not even use
So they probably wouldn't want to use the form either.
Okay.
They would want to just have the minister talk from the heart or from a Bible
So
passage
they
about...
didn't have like any forms for the Lord's Supper?
Correct. They would have avoided
baptism or anything?
forms, correct, yeah. And some of the Presbyterian churches too, they wouldn't want to do certain things that aren't explicitly commanded in the Bible. For example, the Bible doesn't explicitly command you to say the Apostles' Creed together in worship, and so they wouldn't have wanted to do that. Well, the result of all this is that the trustees couldn't find an influential minister. They're looking for an influential minister who could be a strong leader, but what happened is that they couldn't peel any of these ministers away from their charges. Back in those days, from a minister's perspective, to leave a large congregation where you had a lot of influence, to go and become the rector at an upstart university or college in turmoil was not an attractive thing. And so they would fail in the search for at least 2 years. Now, it's 1 year later that Jonathan Edwards is graduating with his master's degree. And so now 1 year later, in May of 1723, you can imagine the sensitivities. There still has been no replacement as the rector. Jonathan Edwards now has completed his master's thesis, which is on the doctrine of justification by faith alone. Now, the one reason he picked that, of course, is he knew that that was becoming a controversial teaching. There were Anglicans who were denying justification by faith alone, and there were Arminians as well. And so Jonathan Edwards is picking a topic in which he can show that he has the ability to defend one of the great doctrines of Protestantism. So that stands, of course, in contrast to what had happened a year ago, where you had the apostasy of people who were trying to weaken Protestantism, according to the Congregationalists. So you can imagine when Edwards got up to speak now, a few years before, when he had graduated with his bachelor's degree, he had been asked to give an oration in Latin. Now that was quite an honor for a bachelor's student, because mostly the master's students would do that. But this time, he was also the person who had to give a public speech, and he also spoke on justification and defended that. So people attended this commencement exercise in May of 1723, and before he gave his talk, Edwards was nervous. I think he was nervous partly because he wanted to make a good impression. He had ideas about a future writing ministry. He had a passion to engage in certain research projects, and in order for that to happen, he probably would need to be connected in some way with Yale. And how would that happen? Well, through being elected a tutor. So he's thinking about his future vocation. But he didn't need to worry so much. He did in his diary say that he was afraid that people thought that he was standoffish and aloof, because I think he was kind of shy as an introvert. And he didn't want to come across like that. And but he made a good impact on his hearers, and I think that led to him being considered as a tutor a year from then. After all, at this time, there was a vacuum of effective leadership. They needed all the good teachers they could get, and the rectorship still remained vacant yet. So Jonathan Edwards now finishes his academic career as a student. He has graduated with the highest degree that is being offered, the master's degree, and that is the sort of degree that can lead to someone being a teacher. So the question is now, what will the young man do with his life? He's a graduate. He doesn't have a position. And in our next section, we'll talk about how his dad begins to put pressure on him to accept the pastorate of a small congregation. Then the Lord will suddenly open the door for him to become a teacher at Yale, a tutor. Also, something else is developing. Jonathan Edwards, as a master's student, yes, he has fallen in love. And in our next video, we will meet Sarah Pierpont, the young lady from New Haven that suddenly Jonathan is very intrigued with.